Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call the meeting to order. If you please kindly take your seat and sign in. Please ensure your electronic device is turned to silent or vibrate. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest this morning? Seeing none, there are no registered presentations or delegations, but we do have a number of reports. We will move to agenda item 5.1 CSD 10 2018. Look for a mover and seconder for that. Councillor Volpatti, go ahead.
Yes, I do. I would like to move the 4 recommendations, Chair, but I have another recommendation I'd like to add, would be recommendation number 5.
Sure, you're the mover, so you can do that.
I'm sorry, and Chair Caslin will be seconding this for me.
Okay, go ahead.
That $1.9 million of the levy-supported capital variance project be transferred to Niagara Regional Housing to support the Niagara Falls Intensification Capital Project. Do you have the wording for that? That $1.9 million of the levy-supported capital variance project be transferred to Niagara Regional Housing to support the Niagara Falls Intensification Capital Project.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. So that's, we will have the clerks work on that. In the meantime,
And just to say, Chair, that the bottom of page 6 of the report outlines a $5 million surplus in levy-supported capital programs. And I think instead of putting that into reserves, we need to support this housing project in Niagara Falls where it is desperately needed.
Okay, thanks for that, Councillor. It's seconded by Chair Kazan. Thank you. We will have an opportunity to speak to the report. However, I do want to give kind of opening comments to this report to our CAO. When you're ready.
Chair.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
On the list, I want to speak. I want to speak second.
CAO, go ahead.
Just waiting for the slide deck to come up. Okay, great. So I wanted to provide committee, through you, Chair, some introductory remarks on our unaudited 2017 results. So as you know, we have a budget. When you include all the operations, our rate programs, we're over $1 billion budget. When you take that budget and you remove about $17.4 million in encumbered projects, so those are projects that had yet to be completed that we're carrying over to the following year, and you take less some reserves about, and I'll break this down to 978,000 going back to some reserves, we are at a net surplus of that $1 billion budget of $17.1 million. And I'll provide you a breakdown with that. When we look at our achievements over 2017, you know, Council's, one of your strategic plans is taxation, to keep taxes low. We've done that, and as you recall, in 2017, we put 1% towards programs and services. We asked for the investment. You did support that investment in 1% in infrastructure funding to go to reserves for infrastructure, and over the term of this council, you averaged 1.48% over the years. New initiatives in our governance, we now have internal controls, a new audited team under leadership of a new director. We initiated improved government relations with our senior levels of government, and as you know, we're well on our way with a GO implementation office to bring work with Metrolinx to bring GO in, and we're working towards a consolidated public transit service. And there was a lot of heavy lifting done by staff when it came to the master plans, which you supported when it comes to our transportation, our wastewater, and our asset management plans. Overall, we've seen a 2017 growth year with record number of permits and record construction value. So what we've seen is when it comes to our levy-supported programs, we're in a surplus of about 900,000. When you look at our regional departments, it was a surplus of 2.4 million. Niagara Housing was a surplus of 1.9 million. Niagara Police, when you add their contributions from reserves, nets out to a negative of 3.1 million. In Niagara Courts, our revenue flow didn't meet our expectations, and so therefore we're in a deficit of about 300,000. When it comes to our rate-supported programs, we're in a surplus of 5.8 million, and you'll see our water and wastewater is about 90,000, and our waste management about 5.7 million. For our capital surplus, we have 5 million in capital surplus that goes to, we're recommended to go to the capital reserve. 1 million capital surplus in our waste management, 2.4 surplus in our wastewater capital, and 2 million in our water capital. You often hear when we're bringing projects to this council of projects that are delayed, some projects that have overruns. But I got to submit to councillors, we completed in 2017 107 capital projects with a surplus of about 10 million. So these are completed projects right across the organization. So you do have a policy of how to direct the surplus or deficit, and that was passed in June 21 of 2012. So areas of consideration recommending surplus allocation to council are as follows. And in the green is where we're recommending you put some of the surplus funds. But you as a committee and council, you can direct staff how you want to see it, but you do have a policy directing it to specific reserves. And so what we're recommending and what you'll see, the consolidation of all those recommendations, is that the levy operating surplus of 900,000 go to the taxpayer relief reserve. 978,000 be returned to their respective reserves, mainly the general capital reserve. 766,000 to the waterfront improvement fund. 100,000 to the drainage assessment grants. 100,000 to the circle route reserve, and 12,000 to the PRIP program. The rate operating surplus of 5.8 million, we're recommending it goes to the various reserves: Waste Management Stabilization Reserve, the Waste Management Landfill Liability Reserve, and the Water Capital Reserve. And then for our capital surplus, a levy capital surplus of 5 million back to the general capital levy, 1 million back to the Waste Management Capital Reserve, 2.4 million to the Wastewater Capital Reserve, and 2 million to the Water Capital Reserve. So those are our recommendations, but should you have further recommendations on what to do to surplus, we'll take it as direction. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, CAO. First, I have to thank you as CAO for this year and this budget. The results speak for themselves. Over $17 million surplus, all in, and the region operating as one team. We're seeing the benefits of it now. This type of operating success throughout the year can only be done by working together across departments, across agencies, and via levy, rate, capital, et cetera, and really from the ground up. So accolades and congratulations to you and your team, CAO, for bringing this good news to us and giving us some good options and how we consider the recommendations before us. There is a speakers list. I will ask the clerk to please put the motion on the screen for everyone to see. And we'll go to you, Councillor Volpatti, back to you as the mover of the motion.
Thank you, Chair. I'll wait till it's on the screen so that everyone can see it. So that the change or the additional recommendation I have is in 5, and
Correct.
it's, that's the way it should be. Um, This is a project that the Niagara Regional Housing Board had slated for this year and that they had determined was the next that should appear on their agenda. So I'm happy to move it forward because I know the need, and I think that we have to move forward with housing because well, everyone has a crisis in housing across the country, and we're no different than anyone else. I can also speak to the report at this time, Chair. Is that,
Yes, both the
All right.
presentation and the report are fine.
first, I got up at 5 o'clock this morning to read it, and it was a great reading. I have a lot of numbers in my head, as I'm sure everybody else does. I really liked the presentation with what has been achieved, where we are financially. The one page that really caught my eye was page 68. I think it's an addendum. It's the reserve summary in thousands of dollars
That's in Appendix 4.
in Appendix 4,
okay.
right. And it's page 68 of that appendix. And the question I want to ask is, are our reserves in total, capital, operating, all reserves, really $276,388? If I can ask that through you, Chair.
Sure. Commissioner Burgess?
Thank you through the chair, that's correct. That's the
Right.
total reserves, both levy, capital, and rate.
Right. Okay, well, that kind of astounded me, so I'm going to have to take some time to digest that, it being only 9, well, almost 10 o'clock.
If I may, Councillor,
Yes.
also, there's 118 million in deferred revenues
Okay.
on top of the reserves.
On top of the reserves. So we have $250 million in reserves, and we also have 118 million in deferred revenue. Can someone explain that and how that happens, please?
Commissioner Burgess?
Through the chair, can you clarify, you want to know the difference between the deferred revenue balance and the
No,
total?
I want to know what is in that deferred revenue account, please.
Through the chair, the deferred revenue is revenue that's received for a restricted external purpose, so it's not really regionally controlled. It's development charges that are received as per the DC bylaw, as well as federal gas tax that's received for a specific purpose. So we could only recognize that as per the terms of those bylaws.
And when will that come into play in our actual budgeting? Through you, Chair.
Through the chair, the federal gas tax, which is about $13 million a year, is earmarked each year essentially for the next year's capital program. And then the development charges are allocated to capital projects as the growth projects occur or are budgeted in the capital forecast.
And how much is in DCs of that 118 million? Sorry, through you, Chair.
The DC portion is the 100 million. The gas tax is 18 in federal and $1 million in provincial.
Okay. So if we add all of that together, we have about 400 million. If that were added, I mean, with the reserves. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get those figures straight in my mind because this is the one page that really caught my eye, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Councillor. So, Councillor Volpetti, just with the addition of number 5, we're going to have to amend an item in number 3. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, no, and actually, we're fine with item number 3. Council may want to consider just slightly changing the wording for number 5, just to transfer to Niagara Regional Housing Capital Reserve. Once you identify it to a specific project, depending, especially since that project hasn't been approved in the 2018 budget, I'm not, you know, if things happen to that project before it actually gets up,
Right.
You'll end up with this restriction that may not be flexible. So you may just want to, as a suggestion, instead of identifying the project, just ask for it to go to Niagara Regional's Capital Reserve.
I think that's satisfactory as long as everybody knows that that's what the intention is, barring any unforeseen circumstances.
yeah, you can even say it just, and that way, then that way NRH's board will then dictate those funds, and I believe the board understands where it's going.
Yes, and I think they've already decided where it's going, so
Yeah.
that shouldn't be an issue, and that's fine with me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Chair Caslin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you for bringing this forward, and as well as the CAO. It's a fantastic result in the budget, and that, you know, being able to keep the taxes for 4 years average below 1.5% increase on the levy. I think this is a fantastic outcome, and I just want to speak a little more to the item that was added, number 5. As you know, housing has been a priority of this council for the entire term. We still have 6,000 people on a waiting list waiting for housing. It's something that at one point I asked for an increase on the levy of 1% just to simply address the housing crisis that we've got. I know that didn't pass. This is a great alternative to funneling some money into the housing that's sorely needed. You know, I've been meeting with people all across the region, and it's not just one community or another. It's every community in Niagara suffers from the lack of affordable housing, and I'm hearing that across the region. As a council, we made it a priority of ours to do that. We've established a template in St. Catharines of a model that works quite well. Hopefully we can see that built shortly. So in terms of transferring $1.9 million to Niagara Regional Housing, I'm in full support, and hopefully we can make that, we can stretch those dollars a long way and get a number of different builds started and get that moving as quickly as possible. So thank you, and I am in support of what's on the screen before us.
Thank you, Chair Caslin. Councillor Quirk.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple quick comments to the presentation by the CAO. I'd just like to say thank you to staff for the 107 capital projects that resulted in a surplus. Often the press refers to those projects that come in over budget and where there's problems, and I know that we are quick as a council to jump on those, but we have to remind the public that we do a lot of projects, and because of the hard work of staff, the vast majority of those projects come in on time and under budget, and these numbers speak to that, so thank you for that. I would just like to get on my high horse for a second with respect to the fact that we're going to take 1.9 million of the $5 million capital levy surplus and put that into housing, which is great, but that also leaves that $3.1 million, which represents the 1% that we added on to the taxpayers levy last year. So we put that aside for capital projects, and now we actually have this $3.1 million that has freed itself up again. Again, we talk about taxpayer affordability, but we at the last minute of the budget cycle for 2017 added that 1% rather arbitrarily because we were going to tackle the infrastructure deficit. And despite the money that we've spent, we were still unable to get $17 million worth of projects out the door. So when we talk about that infrastructure deficit and how much money we have to put into these projects, we should also remember that we can't get all the capital projects that we identify each year out the door in a timely manner. So hopefully that won't be lost when we talk about the budget process next time. With respect to the amendment, I thank Councillor Volpatti and Councillor Caslin for recognizing that housing is a priority, and the work that the Housing Board is doing to look at the alternative service delivery. I know there's going to be discussion about that later, but the projects that they're working for to find new and innovative ways to bring housing to Niagara, I hope the board continues down that route, and when this money comes forward for discussion at the Housing Board, that they look at these alternative service models. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tims.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go back to the slide deck that the CAO presented. We don't have that available to us online or on our iPads.
No, you don't have it currently.
All right. So could you bring it up? I'm trying to reconcile that presentation with the motion in front of us on Okay, so the levy, a couple more slides, I guess. Advance it a couple.
That's the last slide currently, Councillor.
All
We'll go
right,
back.
then I want to go back to the beginning. There was something about 900,000 and then how we were going to split up the 900,000. Maybe we start at the beginning and we'll go through it and I'll tell you where to stop. Okay. Next. Right there. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, 978. So there's operating levy surplus is 900,000 to the relief fund. 978,000 returned to respective reserves. So what are the two numbers? Forgive me if I don't catch it the first time around.
That's okay, Councillor. We'll get an answer, an answer for you, Director Chamberlain.
Thank you.
Through the chair, the 900,000 in the first bullet is separate and distinct from the second bullet. The 900,000 is already net of a number of different initiatives within the budget that were funded with reserves that actually didn't spend the whole allotment of funds. So those funds would be returned back to the respective reserves the money came from before we calculate the year-end surplus. So that 978 is being returned to the individual reserves below because 766,000 for the waterfront improvement fund came from the general capital levy, was unspent, so it would go back to that reserve. And similarly, the 100,000 on the drainage assessment grants, circle route, et cetera, they're going back to the respective reserves because those annual allocations in the 17 budget were unspent. So they would go back, and that's the 900,000 in the first bullet is already net of those $978,000 amounts.
All right, so the motion in front of us deals with the 900, which is in the top line. And the 978 is not anywhere in the motion.
Through the chair, the 978,000, because it's essentially more of an information piece, because we only fund the expenditure to the extent that it occurs. So it's not there's no recommendation to take money out of the reserve that we didn't need. It's just an information piece in the content of the report.
Okay, so that's really not relevant to the motion because the motion deals with the 900, not the 978. Okay. So my second question then is, we will have to at some point have specific motions to pull the 776 out of the general capital. We'll have to pull it back out of some fund to put it back into the waterfront improvement fund?
Through the chair, each year there's an allocation in the budget for the waterfront improvement fund. In 2017, it was $1 million budget funded from the general capital levy. In 2018, it's 900,000 funded from the general capital levy. So the money would just roll over through to the general capital levy back into the next year's budget.
Okay, so in 2017 then, we had $1 million available. We did not spend $1 million in the waterfront. We only spent 234,000.
That's correct.
All right. And on the circle route reserve of 100,000, same thing. It was available. We did not spend it.
That was the full amount that was approved via budget amendment earlier in 2017, and that amount was not spent. So the whole 100,000 was back to the capital levy.
So in order to spend, we have to do another motion to pull those back in and make them available. Well, we have already passed the 2018 budget that identified how much is available. All right, okay, I think I'm getting the drift of this. Those are my concerns was both the waterfront and the circle route, the projects. And I think we need to spend some attention in getting something done on those in the next year, but they're already in the 2018 budget. This isn't, this really replenishes and makes sure the 2018 is doable because we're putting this money back into it. All right, that's helpful, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Timms. Councillor Burrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this report, which has been very useful. Staying on if you could go back up on the present, there was a reconciliation, dollars, further up, I think. No, something that came to 17 million. No. No.
CAO, go ahead.
Anyway, I assume you're sending us this presentation,
Clerks have just emailed it, yes.
and I can come back to it at another time. There was one that, there.
I think we found it.
I'm not clear on why you're trying to take it out. I appreciate what encumbered means, and that's fine. Maybe if we started with a number and then did those two things, that would come to the surplus total. Anyway, it's just the presentation. I'm happy with the number. The other question I do have is at the very start of this thing, there seemed to be this amendment number 1 seemed to have been predetermined, and suddenly it's on the list, and I thought we'd be talking about the amendment first. What I'm unclear about, were staff aware so their presentations could be adjusted to show this? We've got a document and now we've got a different amendment, and I like to have staff involved so they know what is the effect, or depend on staff to advise us. So did that happen? Was staff aware of this First Amendment?
So
I feel
I
like
guess
an
I'll clear. So
American First Amendment.
Councillor Bapati moved the motion, and so as you
No,
know.
I know how it got here.
Yeah, so I don't know if there was communication with staff or not in advance. I guess I'll ask the CEO.
I'm suggesting there should be, Mr. Chair. And secondly, many of us probably didn't know about this amendment coming forward, and yet clearly some did.
Well, to be clear,
I'm not against it.
To be clear, Councillor, it's not an amendment. It's not an amendment. She moved the motion, and that's part of the motion that she made. Let's get an answer for you is if whether or not staff had a heads up. CEO.
Through Chair to Council Burrows. So I am aware of the letter that we received from Niagara Housing, which referenced the number. So we were aware of that. But what I put in my presentation is the policy, C003, which kind of directs staff of where to put the surplus funds. But then council has the opportunity to direct us otherwise.
I think that's a weak process when staff are not advised that this is coming up. I'm all in favor of the amendment. I'm not in favor of the process to get there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to repeat what Councillor Burrows has had to say, but I also have no difficulty with Councillor Volpatti's motion, and I hope that this motion will become more of a mainstay in the capital budget in the future until this crisis gets under control. However, Mr. Chairman, there's an issue here with the work plan, and I am very, very pleased that Mr. D'Angelo presented to us this morning to clarify the policy, and I hope to hear from him soon as we start to have deliberations about the 2018 budget, because I think it's important to not over levy, but it's also important to get the work done and to have money available to deal with the gaps. It's also important not to overcharge on DCs. So, you know, we can all create our own list about why we think this happened, and there's a lot of very good reasons why these numbers are here. But I believe that fundamentally we have an issue with understanding the progression and the completion, if you will, of the work plan, and we should be hearing about this on an ongoing basis, because these decisions about where money should go and what priority work should or should not be done, when it comes down to this, it would have been very, very beneficial to have heard this 3 or 4 times throughout the year. I think this is a very good report. It certainly lays everything out. You know where you're going right now, but we are missing an important piece here. And I would certainly appreciate hearing on a more regular basis, quarterly, from the CAO on where we stand with these projects. I think it's going to be very important. We have to understand, because the CAO is the employee of council, we have to understand how the CAO thinks. We have to be able to support the CAO when changes need to be made. And I think that this is a symptom of a much bigger problem. Not a problem, let's not use that word. It's a symptom of a condition that we need to get a hand on. We don't have it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Easton. I guess I don't want to leave the sense that there's not information sharing, because there is. There's regular quarterly reports, there's regular updates, there's regular project status updates, particularly at Public Works, et cetera. And I know the staff have always been very open and transparent and forthcoming with any kind of information requests, et cetera. So if there's specific information requests that you'd like to see, anytime, put it on the floor for this council, or pick up the phone and talk to them. I know they're very open. And I just don't want to leave a sense that there's not information sharing, because there is.
I'm not implying that at all, Mr. Chairman, and I'm asking for it to be done as a more routinized part of what we do as a council, so that we all hear the information at the same time, and that it's done at the highest level in terms of the judgment of the CAO and the senior staff, in terms of information that needs to come forward to everybody. Everybody. So it's not to imply any limitations or any desire to keep information from us, but we do need to be more involved. And I don't think we should have to ask questions necessarily. Of course, we will need to ask questions, but there's a routine here around the work plan that I would like to see coming forward to council on a regular basis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Annunziata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was actually answered, but if I can get a total breakdown of that 107 capital projects, what's the value? And you don't have to get it from me right now, but I'd like to know. Oh, you got it? Oh, okay. So the total value of those 107 capital projects is?
Through the chair, the Appendix 4 has a capital project summary, which shows that there's $1 billion worth of capital project budget remaining, with or total budget, with the budget remaining after commitments of $334,000. It's page 65 of Appendix 4. Also included in that appendix is a listing of every project over $1 million, with a status of that project.
What page is that? I'm sorry.
It's page 65 of the Appendix 4. It probably has a different page number if you scroll through, but if you looked at Appendix 4, the page number's in the bottom right-hand corner.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
CAO.
Through you, Chair, back to Councillor Easton, if I may, hearing your comments related to information sharing. What I can offer is that staff does provide capital forecasts throughout the year. So maybe what we can do in our quarterly reports is highlight it more. The Commissioner and I, we have a lot of conversations on projects that are not hitting it on time, but those are the rarities. Most of them hit on time and on budget. So what I can commit to is bring in more regular quarterly updates, giving you the capital forecast of where we're at. Thanks for the suggestion.
Commissioner Burgess.
Thank you. Through the chair, I just wanted to correct a previous statement made to Councillor Timms' question. He's correct with regards to the waterfront project. With regards to the circle route, that was not put into the budget in 2018. But if there was a project that came up for that, you would request a budget amendment if there was a project, and then you could move from the capital reserve for a specific project at that point in time. So just didn't want that error to be left. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor D'Angelo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we just see the motion that we're voting on the screen?
Yes.
I just wanted to comment on the amendment that was added to the motion regarding 1.9 million. Again, I want to congratulate Niagara Regional Housing staff for doing a great job. Great management brought great results in. With that, they also brought the suggestion in of moving forward with a project that's a year or two further down the scope. So again, rewarding an ABC that's done a good job, and reallocating the funds into housing is a great idea. I'll be supporting that. I do have some comments, and just want to make sure. Okay, yeah, because I thought it was changed. There was some discussion there about not identifying it for the Niagara Falls intensification project, but just being transferred to the NRH-owned reserves. But I guess if the motion identifies the Niagara Falls project, I'm happy with that because that's exactly where the board wants to spend it. That's the next project that was identified. It's an exciting time because I've been on the board quite a while, and it's been over 5 years. We rationalized our properties and identified areas where we can intensify and help with the wait list and build up our own stock. And finally, there's some money coming forward to do that. It's been sitting there on the books for quite a while, so it's great to see that. We have the Carlton Street project that's moving forward very effectively and managed well. We have the Welland project, the intensification again. So we're going to be having 3 builds probably in the same time frame, something that Niagara Regional Housing's never done in the past because of lack of funding. And these have been pretty significant builds. I know the Niagara Falls intensification project's going to add an additional 40 units beyond what's there right now. But what I wanted to suggest here, because we want to move forward, get it shovel ready, that intensification project is about $8.4 million on the initial report that came forward. That means that we require usually around 25% of that, and then we can leverage provincial and federal funding on top of that. So to get us there, the initial report said we require $2.29 million. We have the 1.9 from the surplus. That leaves us short about $390,000. And we just heard earlier there's $3.1 million available for funding. I would like to amend that so that we add the 390. That puts us to the 2.25% roughly, and that puts us in a great position to leverage the provincial funding. That's money right now, the 3.1 that's sitting there, not allocated to anything. So I think here's a good opportunity to show the federal and provincial government we're ready to move and ready to move forward with projects in our community. We have something that's shovel ready. So I think this would be a good amendment to that, which would put Niagara Regional Housing in a perfect position and move on this project. So I'd like to amend that.
Okay, so thank you. I guess, so first of all, let's see if it's friendly, because it sounds like it is. You'd like to change the 1.9 million to 2.21 million?
2.29, which was off one of the initial reports that the board had.
2.29, okay. And as the mover, you're fine with that, Councillor? Chair Caslin.
What do we get for that?
All the money you need.
Well, this,
Councillor D'Angelo, I think explained it. It was to try to leverage additional funding from other levels of government.
it puts us at a 25% level, which is usually a critical number when you're looking at provincial and federal funding. And it goes to the one particular project that we're moving forward on, which is additional 40 units of intensification beyond what's there right now.
Okay, I'll agree to the Chair of Regional Housing's request.
Okay, that's fine, Councillor D'Angelo.
No, that's it. I'm very pleased that we can move forward with this project. It's something Niagara Regional Housing's been wanting to do for a while. So I'm happy with the amended, the friendly amended number 5. Thank you. That's it for my comments.
Great, thank you. Councillor, well, yes, thank you, because Councillor Vopati's up.
I just wanted to add, and it's not in the amendment, I seconded that, so that was good. What I want to say is that I was remiss, because it was very early in the morning when I looked at this, to say where I thought this 1.9 million would come from, and it's on page 6. Levy programs, $5 million surplus. And it was clear to me that's where it should go. So I don't think there's any surprises here, any lack of information. The information is in the report we got this morning, or that was for this morning. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Quirk.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask through you to the Chair of Housing that the project is, the total projects is 8.4 million?
Yeah, the original initial report is 8.4 million.
And we have to pay 25% through you, Chair?
Well, the 25% helps in terms of sustainability and also the matching of the funds. We do have the interim CEO here if you'd like to further detail of that.
My only question, I support it 100% to put it in housing, and if that's what you need, it's just 2.29 isn't 25% of 8.4 million. So if there's additional funds that are required, you should have the right amount, and that I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I did. The interim CEO did give me the 2.29 million number from the initial report, so there must be some additional costs that are not covered under the 8.4. I don't know if they're, like I said, I can't elaborate on those, but the math didn't work for me either, but
no, it works. If that's what the CEO says we need, then that's what we need. So thank you.
Okay, great. Councillor Burrows for a second time. Go ahead.
Thank you. Is there a relationship between the 1.9 in item 1 and this amended 2.29? Do we have to change the first one?
Thank you. Through the chair, no, we don't have to change recommendation number 1 in relation to 5. Number 1 is the operational funds, and number 5 are the capital funds, so they're the 2 separate budget pots.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Maves, go ahead.
Thank you. Can I ask about the encumbrance report? That's the appendix 1?
Yes.
So, I'm just zipping through the encumbrance report, and it specifies some of the projects or programs in public realm, for instance, that weren't spent. Now, it's encumbered for 2018. So that money for sure is going to go out the door in 2018, or is that just that, for example, Rural Route 20 Lundy's Lane, the project's done, and we allocated $29,000 more money than we needed. So is it surplus, or we know it's going to that program in 2018?
Thank you. Through the chair, for it to be encumbered, there has to be the project has to be in process, or it may not be the exact dollar amount. In some of these programs, like the public realm, the municipalities have to provide us with the receipts of what they spent to prove, and then we transfer the funds to them. So in many cases, we're waiting for documentation or waiting for the project to be completed, but we committed to that project this year. So there's a high degree likelihood that that money would be out the door in 2018 once the forms are completed or the projects are completed. And that's our best estimate at that time of what the exact cost is.
Okay, so the one I was very curious about was in Public Works. Now I don't know if I found it in this report or the other report. Oh, the combined sewer overflow funding. And there's 9.5 million in that program. And some of these appear to go back to 2015. So now I'm reading that as in 2015, the program was underway and the money is still being encumbered because the 2015 program is incomplete. So am I reading that one incorrectly?
You are correct. There was some change in the policy more recently where the program was supposed to be grandfathered for 3 years, but that was in a revision to the CSO. So there are still some lagging older projects that didn't have that grandfathering in them. So we're still following up with the municipalities to understand the status of those commitments that we've made in the budget.
Okay, so each year when this program comes up in Public Works, a lot of the Public Works Committee is clamoring for more money. And each year, the Public Works staff says, we can't get it out the door because the municipalities can't complete the programs in time, and the municipalities are fine with the amount of funding available. This tells me that the amount of money that we are making available is more than adequate. Anyone else come to that conclusion?
Through the chair, certainly I think Mr. Tripp would want to comment as well, but we have acknowledged that the amount that we had been committing in previous years in the budget was more than they could spend, so we've scaled it down. I believe when in 2014 it was about $6 million a year. Now we're down to about $4 million a year as a result of that information. So we are trying to respond to the fact that the spend is not happening as quickly and modifying the budget accordingly.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Rigby, as a courtesy.
I appreciate the courtesy, and as I'm not a member of this committee, but I just wanted to comment on how much I appreciated this report overall. And the adjustment that is being made in the motion is both the first adjustment and then the suggestion by Councillor D'Angela to bring it up to that 25%, I think is very important as we go forward and involving the housing and how we provide additional housing for people who are far less fortunate than we are. So I thank you for that ability or offer to be able to speak to it. Thank you.
Great, Councillor Rigby, thank you. Your comments are always welcome. So seeing no other speakers, I just do want to thank staff once again for their work throughout the year. It's just incredible job. There's no shortage of financial challenges, and it's fair to say that you have succeeded on behalf of residents and taxpayers and for us to consider and deliberate today. So thank you so much. With that, I'll call the question. All in favor? Recorded vote has been requested. I'll look to the clerk to open the vote when ready.
The vote is open.
That is approved unanimously. Thank you. Okay, we have a CSD 14, Alternative Service Delivery Social Housing. I'll get a mover and seconder to put on the floor. Then there is a presentation. So Councillor Volpatti, seconded by Councillor Easton. Thank you. Mr. Ning from Ernst & Young, I welcome you to the podium. Welcome, sir, when you're ready.
Through the chair, good morning, everyone. Today, my name is Edward Ng. I'm with Ernst & Young. I'm here to present summary results from a report conducted by Ernst & Young and SHS Consulting. So I have some slides to go through, which I believe everyone has. There's a lot of detail in the slides, so I will try to run through them fairly quickly to enable time for questions. And thank you for having me here today. As I mentioned, Ernst & Young, or EY, and SHS Consulting were engaged by the Niagara region about a year ago now to conduct an alternative service delivery review for the region and its social housing programs. There were 6 major areas of focus for our study. They are shown on the slides here. The first 2 have to do with the property management and service manager functions. So that is looking at the real estate function that exists within Niagara Regional Housing, or NRH, and also the service manager function within NRH. The third area was to look at financial sustainability, and this is particularly in light of the end of operating agreements to come in the not too distant future. The fourth area was to look at the housing portfolio mix. So really just to look at whether the current portfolio of housing that's provided is suitable for the needs of the region, or if some reallocation needs to be made. Wait list reduction. So obviously there is a very lengthy wait list for social housing. So an examination of whether there's some opportunity to help reduce the wait list. And finally, market development strategies. So, are there ways to increase capacity for social housing? The first two areas, property management and service manager functions, I've grouped them together here. But essentially, in looking at the property management function and the service manager functions, within NRH, we conducted some primary and secondary research on neighboring jurisdictions as well as globally to determine how other jurisdictions are really treating these two functions. And in particular, did an in-depth review of some neighboring regions here in Ontario. From that, we looked at three potential operating models as it relates to these two functions. The first is a status quo function, so really as is. So that's retain the current division of the service manager functions between the region and NRH. A hybrid structure was to look at whether there was an opportunity to separate real estate operations currently existing within NRH from service manager functions. And what that would entail would be to retain the real estate functions within NRH and perhaps take some of the service manager functions and move them directly into the region. And the third was a fully integrated model, and that is the possibility of dissolving NRH and moving all of those functions directly into the region. In summary, the recommendation that we came up with as a result of some analysis, which I'll go through in subsequent slides, is the hybrid structure. So really to look at separating the property management and the service manager functions, the property management functions staying within NRH, and the service manager functions moving under community services within the region. Much of this is in light of a lot of the change that will happen as a result of the end of operating agreements, and this would allow for NRH to be able to focus on property management, real estate development, and long-term planning for its assets. I'm going to jump to slide 5. Just wanted to highlight some of the criteria that we did use to evaluate these three models or operating models. They're listed here. There's 10 different criteria that were examined, but we used this as a way to determine which operating model would have the greatest alignment with some of the objectives set out. And as you can see there, the hybrid model did come out on top. The third area of examination was related to financial sustainability. Again, this was really related to the end of operating agreements that will be forthcoming in the not too distant future. With this, we developed a set of criteria, if you will, to begin to examine the portfolio of assets at NRH. These focused around community amenities, neighboring density, operating costs, and capital requirements. We did use this criteria to review some of the assets at NRH, and as a result, our recommendation here is really to conduct a detailed review of all of the assets within NRH against these criteria in order to make some determinations if measures can be taken at the end of operating agreements. What these criteria do, again, there's four of them, with the operating costs broken out into two subcategories of repairs and maintenance and utility, is to allow you to be able to, on an asset-by-asset basis, determine whether it makes sense for that asset to be intensified, redeveloped, retained, or disposed of. Housing portfolio mix, that was the fourth area. There are some observations that came out of the work and review that we did related to the current housing portfolio mix. The first and foremost is that there's a significant growing shortage of one-bedroom units targeted to non-senior singles. You do have a number of one-bedroom units and a good supply of them, but they are targeted towards seniors. We also don't, based on demographics, we don't see that demand for the one-bedroom senior units to be decreasing. So our recommendation there is to carry forward, but to turn attention and focus to non-senior singles and units that would accommodate them. We also observed that the demand for larger units, so that's units of kind of 4 bedrooms plus, there's much less of a need for that. So there's an opportunity to reduce the number of such units. And when looking at the different needs within the geographical areas within the region, we found that there is no kind of one particular area that's concentrated that has a particular need. It really is quite dispersed throughout the region. So our recommendation here related to housing portfolio mix is to shift a near-term focus to these one-bedroom units targeted to non-senior singles. Market development strategies. Here we undertook to review a number of different market development strategies that could be available to the region. Some of them are listed here. Sorry, let me go back. Development-related incentives. This is things like development charge waivers, property tax exemptions, et cetera. Land banking strategies, new construction, portable housing allowances and secondary unit programs, which you do have some of, but not extensively, and the potential for public-private partnerships or P3 arrangements. From this, we took that there's no particular development strategy that should take priority. All could potentially have a place for you here within the region. But one of our key recommendations coming out of this is to explore revitalization and portfolio development opportunities with community partners. So that's undertaking community joint ventures. This is in particular because of, again, these end of operating agreements that will be forthcoming, and a large proportion of your social housing actually being provided by community providers and not-for-profit providers. So spending time to understand what their intentions are after the end of operating agreements are upon us. Those are the 6 areas. One thing I did want to highlight is the draft version of our report was completed in the fall of 2017, so last year, and subsequent to the release of our report, there have been a number of other reports that many of you will have already seen. One is from the Auditor General of Ontario. That report actually has a chapter related to social and affordable housing. The second is a report at the provincial level from the Human Service Integration Office of Ministry of Community and Social Services. And the third is the National Housing Strategy. For those of you who have not seen these reports, would encourage you to pick them up. There are a number of recommendations in those reports that do align with some of the recommendations that we've made here. Thank you for your time, and please take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ning. We do have a bit of a speakers list. I'll take now questions to the report and or the presentation. Councillor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, through you to the speaker, could you go to the very last slide, Mr. Ning?
This one?
Yes, no, sorry, this one, the summary recommendations. We've been a year at this process, and I think those of us that have been involved have a pretty good understanding of how the progression of this is going to roll out. However, this next phase of consultation is going to be pretty important to the providers. And I just would like you to describe in even more detail than you have here what that consultation would look like, because I want to ensure that when we leave here today, Mr. Chairman, that the providers understand that once the policy direction is set by council, that there will be a very, very important place for them to participate for some time in order for this piece to be dealt with. What's a more expansive description of that?
I think the consultation with the not-for-profit providers, through the chair, I would agree that will be quite an extensive process. So I think it will be meeting individually with all of the current not-for-profit providers. First of all, to understand if they have any concerns with the end of operating agreements, to understand if they actually intend to exit the social housing and affordable housing realm when end of operating agreements come. There is potential that they could just move to market type units at the end of the operating agreements, and to identify with them whether or not they have surplus lands or whether some of their properties could be intensified, and really doing that on a not-for-profit provider by not-for-profit provider basis and on an asset by asset basis, and to identify from there which ones might be high potential so that you could advance those ones forward to develop a plan around them, and in such case have shovel-ready projects to undertake when funding does come available. So I would foresee that process to be quite extensive and probably a 12-month process.
And Mr. Chairman, just further on the EOA concerns, as we went through the process to get to the point we are today, I recall those very early meetings where the EOA concerns seemed to be overwhelming. Yeah. They seem to really have overtaken thought processes. However, as we got closer to the end, we realized that this should not be seen as a negative specter, that there were ways to manage this. Could you speak about that?
Absolutely. Actually, we see it more as an opportunity than really something to be fearful of. These end of operating agreements give you an opportunity to, again, look at each of these assets and make long-term plans for them. And that really ties back to our first recommendation related to the property management function and the service manager function. We think that as you get to the end of operating agreements, there is a opportunity, but also a very intense need to be actually making long-term plans about your assets and kind of what to do with each of them on a go-forward basis. We think that the current structure with both the property management function and the service manager function makes it challenging to have them rolled into one. So to be able to separate the two really allows for that focus to happen.
And Mr. Chairman, my final question of Mr. Ng, and this is strictly an observation, very subjective, I'm sure. The last committee meeting that we had, you and your colleagues attended, and would you comment on your observations of the relationship between the Niagara Regional Housing staff and the staff of the region? And I'm not talking about this, Mr. Chairman, this isn't to look at individuals, and talking about a dynamic here that I think is very important to come from an outside person.
Okay, through the chair, I guess I would say that it's a relationship that I'd say the two groups are working together as best as they can. I think that my sense is that particularly over the last number of years, there have been a lot of strides to work together quite cooperatively under the constraints that are there. But they're just organizationally and how things are structured. There are constraints, and so it's really been the great work of the staff of both NRH and the region and to full credit to them to kind of have worked as cooperatively as possible and productively as possible under the current structure.
Thank you. That's not an easy question, and Mr. Chairman, because it's such a strong linchpin to what we're going to be discussing when we go to the report. I really wanted committee to hear that from Mr. Ng, because it's as objective as we're going to get. Mr. Chairman, I will speak further to the work of the committee when we go to the report. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I'll come back to you at that time when you're ready. Councillor Volpatti?
Sorry, thank you, Chair. And I want to state that I appreciate all of your work with E&Y on the report. I found that it's evidence-based, it's well-informed, it's constructive, it's unbiased, and I thought it was very thorough. So just to put that on the table.
Thank you.
I'm really pleased that you didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that you had, in your recommendation, have hit a middle ground. And my question, one of them is, if you will distinguish for us, please, the difference between the service manager function and the real estate. I'll call it the real estate function.
Yeah, okay, I'm just going to move back a few slides, if I may. Okay, so through the chair, the difference really between the two is, sorry, I'm just going to, so right now within NRH, and this would be the status quo option, all those functions exist within NRH. So within NRH, there's a capital works and there are capital works and property administration units. This accounts for all of the property management, the planning, the long-term planning in terms of future investments, strategy for the overall portfolio. That's what I would call the property management function. And then there's the service manager function, which I would call a little bit maybe more the human element of social housing delivery, but this is really dealing and managing the wait list, taking the applicants, doing the testing that is currently done in terms of asset limits and income limits to provide for social housing, dealing and working with applicants on a case-by-case basis to kind of get them through the process and to ultimately get them placed into each of the units. So that's how I would separate, that's how I would just characterize the two of them. And part of, I think, the separation of the property management function and the social and service manager function really is to complement really a lot of the good work that's already done within community services within the region. So there already is a homelessness element within community services, and we really view, and based on any of the research that we've done in speaking to other jurisdictions, there's a need to really look at social housing delivery in terms of a continuum, and in terms of when servicing the people within that housing need and spectrum, to really kind of have a one-stop shop for that. So we see that as kind of fitting within the region, and that's in part why we have the recommendation to move the service management function into the region. And that's really separated from the property management function, which, as you've just described, is a really real estate function. So it really frees up NRH to take a portfolio management approach to all of its assets.
Thank you. And I just wanted to emphasize one thing that Mr. Ng just said, and that is that about the one-stop shop philosophy is really a philosophy that the province is moving toward as well.
Absolutely. I did refer to a few studies kind of towards the end, but within the province, if you, and for others in the room, if you were to take a look at the middle report there, that's from the Human Services Integration Office. That really is the direction that they are moving. They provided early indication of that. We actually met with them and spoke to them, but their view is this sort of idea of a continuum as well, and integration of services to support the needs of Ontario residents.
Right, thank you. And one thing that struck me as I reread the report for the 100th time, I think, but anyway, was that one of the lacks that you found in the Niagara Regional Housing process was in long-term strategic planning.
Yes.
Could you just talk about that for a minute?
Absolutely. So through the chair, I think that's not something that is, I would say, unique to NRH. Right. It's really because this property management function, which is, I'll just say it's the real estate function, and the service manager function are really rolled into one. So, again, given many of the constraints that NRH has, just resourcing constraints, whether it be people or otherwise, the focus, and rightly should be, the immediate focus should always be the people and the residents
course.
and their service and well-being. We know that the people who are living in social housing right now are happy with the service that they get, and that's, again, credit of NRH. But because there is so much attention required there, it really diverts attention away from the long-term and strategic planning that's required.
Yeah, and through you, Chair, I think that's a really important point that we need to remember. But I want to echo Councillor Easton's comments about the providers, how important they are to the whole system, and that we need to make sure that they are extensively consulted and forward going.
Yeah, through the chair, there's full acknowledgement that that's not an easy process, and it's certainly a long one as well. So I think developing a strategy on how to engage with some of these community partners is important before you actually even engage with them.
And nothing about an important determinant of health as housing is really easy. This is a very complex problem.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I look forward to the discussions this morning and to the committee of the whole discussion as well on this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Quirk.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to E&Y for the work they've done on this presentation. We had a chance to see it a lot and had a lot of discussion on alternative service delivery. I'd like to speak to the report. I don't have any questions for the presenter. Thank you, Chair.
Chair Caslin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just turn to the slide that you didn't talk about, if I could. It's on page 4.
Sure.
If you could go back to that. Just wanted to explore that just a little more. Yeah. I know there's a recommendation in the report, but you talked about a misalignment of responsibility and reporting relationship. Is there a reason why you skipped this slide?
Oh, no, there isn't. I just knew I had a time limit after I prepared these slides, so I was just focusing on the recommendations.
Well, maybe you could explain just a little bit about what the content of this slide is, just because I think it's important for us as the overseers of the activity that takes place.
Okay, sure. Through the chair. So really, this slide really just highlights a number of different observations that we had when reviewing the property management and service manager functions. So that concept of misalignment really is just that the region is responsible for, so I'm referring to the text on the left. I apologize, there's so much text on this slide. But the region remains responsible for the service manager function. It's been delegated to the region to be accountable for all those responsibilities. Yet those responsibilities are then subsequently delegated to NRH. So in a way, it's a very indirect control that the region has over the service manager function, yet you're accountable for it. So that's all we mean by the misalignment. Some of the other observations that we have here, I'm happy to speak to any of them, but I think, when I look at the first one, this is the idea of the point I had made earlier with respect to the full continuum. So because there is there's a division of some of the policies within housing and homelessness between NRH and the region. Some of it sitting within NRH, some sitting within community services. It's not easy to be able to look at the full continuum of housing services that are available to the residents of the region. So that's one of the drivers of our recommendation to move the service manager function into the region, because it allows for the staff and the community services group to have a much more holistic view on things.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I could just break it down a little simpler than that. Yep. I think what you're asking for, because I can see created gaps, potential conflict, all those words in this slide deck. And I'm wondering, are you suggesting then that the region be responsible for the administrative aspects of social housing, and that Niagara Regional Housing be responsible for the hard assets?
Yes.
Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah. To just put it in straightforward terms, I would agree with that through the chair.
What, around the province, around Southern Ontario, what other models exist? Is this the model that we have? Is that typical, or is the model that you've just recommended more typical?
I'd say that through the chair, the model that we've just recommended is more typical. We did spend some time speaking to neighboring jurisdictions, just to name a few examples: Halton Region, City of Hamilton, Waterloo, Oxford County. We spoke to them. They have a model that's to varying degrees, more aligned with the hybrid model that we suggested, rather than the status quo model that we currently have.
So let me ask a question just a little bit differently. Does anybody have the same model that we have?
Not exactly the way that you have it, no, that we found.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor D'Angelo?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions here for the presenter, and I'll just follow up with Chair Kaslin's comments on, and I want to get a bit of clarity on this and how this would be a little better. The reconciling of the housing mix being the social side of it, and then the property management side, which would be the rental component of the facilities. How would you manage that? Because they would both have different objectives. If I was in charge of the property management side, you're concerned about fiscal responsibility and feasibility, so you would want to make sure that you maximize the returns on the properties that you own. But yet when you talk about a housing mix, that greatly, it could be contrary to what you want from a property management side. So let me hear your comments a little bit on that particular question, because that's something Niagara Regional Housing struggled for a long time with, because, and we still have that issue with the correct housing mix. And the problem is we haven't built any new units to modify the housing mix. It was downloaded from the province in 2001 with very little reserves, and the buildings in not the greatest shape, some of them. That was downloaded here to the region, and all of a sudden now the region's responsible for that. So to say, well, you're going to change that quickly and rapidly without any funds, you can't do that. So I want to hear a little bit more about the housing mix and the property management side and how they...
Through the chair, thank you for your question, and that's a fair point. I think that any way you slice it, there's going to be some coordination effort that's required, and you're not going to have really a fully integrated planning solution unless you go with the third model, which is the fully integrated model. What we have suggested within our report to help mitigate that is an affordable housing coalition, where the affordable housing programs, social housing programs, housing access center, they would all come together. So NRH, community services, the region would come together to have a coalition to meet regularly to hopefully align objectives. So completely take your point that while separating the two functions could potentially also lead to other types of misalignment, but we believe that if the directive is kind of set by this coalition, that it can help guide both the property management and the delivery of assets and the I guess rebalancing of the portfolio. It can coordinate that with the service manager and service delivery side of things for social housing.
Okay, just to follow up to you, Mr. Chair, regarding that, then who do you see running the coalition? Who do you see at the table at the coalition? Who do you see having the influence, and who do you see making the final determination?
Yeah, through the chair, I think for that, for the coalition, we'd have to work out details on kind of who has what seats and votes and things like that. But we would expect that it would be a core group in the coalition that has representation by both NRH and the region. And there would be someone that would be appointed to chair that committee or task force.
Okay, so it sounds like to me that regardless of what solution you pick, there's going to be some misalignment somewhere along the way.
That's fair to say. I think whichever solution that you choose, there will need to be a lot of care taken to just making sure that priorities are aligned.
Okay, that's good. Just getting back to the original model that NRH has here, and I know Councillor Timms and I know Councillor Marshall isn't here. They were actually participants of the original model that was probably distinct and unique. I know around here we always like to say we would like to make the Niagara solution our own solution,
sure.
Not necessarily cut and paste someone else's solution or their problems that come along with some of their solutions. So I just want to give some councillors that weren't here when that happened, I believe it was 2001, it was an extensive public process that went through, and the providers did a lot of consultation with the providers, and that's the ultimate system that was set up was what we have currently. and it's gone through some modifications. And one of the things that NRH has probably struggled with over the last decade is the governance. It always seems to be brought up, and there's individuals that don't like it one way, there's other individuals like it another way. So when you talk about long-term planning, it was always difficult for NRH to do long-term planning because they didn't know if they'd be there the next day. Several times it has come back to council for a vote of some sort to see if we continue. When would you see, I know through this, through your report, you talked for further consultation. You talked about consultation with the providers. Were they not consulted throughout the process so far, or is that going to be the next step? Because you mentioned a couple things. You talked about end of operating agreements. If the providers are going to still maintain that or not. Well, I know of one provider that is going to get out of the operating agreement. So I think if it hasn't been done yet, we're behind the ball on that because some of these agreements are going to be ending very soon. So maybe if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Absolutely.
What was done with the providers? Yeah.
Through the chair, sorry, I just wanted to make one earlier point just before I respond to that question. Completely agree and acknowledge that, you know, I think when dealing with any jurisdiction, you want to develop a local solution, and it's important not just to be cutting and pasting something that might be successful somewhere else and bringing it into the Niagara region. I think that's very important. You know, we did observe that this hybrid model that we're suggesting is used in other jurisdictions, absolutely. That helped us identify that as one potential model, but that's not why we recommended it. We did use 10 different criteria that we developed in order to evaluate the different delivery options in order to come to what we felt was greatest alignment with some of the objectives of the region, and that's why we recommended the hybrid. I just wanted to clarify that for the group here, that it wasn't simply because we have observed many other jurisdictions using a similar delivery model. Just in terms of your question about consultations, there was some selected consultation that was done both with private providers and community providers, but we acknowledge it was limited given the scope of the assignment. So with the end of operating agreements, of course they are staggered kind of over time. The ones that are more immediately going to expire, it will be a bit of a rush to determine kind of how to move forward with them, absolutely. So we would recommend placing them as a priority in terms of the first on the list to consolidate.
Okay, just because I know NRH is constantly working with those providers to maintain those relationships and also look at ways of maintaining them afterwards through different programs and also budgeting for it. So it's a difficult process to continue because some are opting out of it because the asset value is more valuable to them to go to market rent than to continue with the RGIs. The other question I had here was, the other question, I know you mentioned the rationalization of properties or looking at intensifying providers. Again, you mentioned that you just spoke briefly on that. Are you aware that Niagara Regional Housing has been doing that quite extensively with our local providers and actually funded 2 projects on their properties in one of our last go-rounds in terms of identifying areas where, as they call it, low-picking fruit in terms of getting units onto the ground so people could move in as quickly as possible. Were you aware of that?
We are aware of that. Through the chair, we are aware of that. What we're recommending here in our financial sustainability recommendation, excuse me just for a moment, is we're not suggesting that activities have not been undertaken to either intensify, redevelop, retain or dispose. Those are the 4 options that we suggested. Our observation was just that in speaking with NRH staff, that it didn't appear as though there was a long-term planning process undertaken in a systematic way for the entire portfolio. So all we are suggesting here is that certain criteria be used in a systematic way across the entire portfolio to identify kind of what options are available to it. But we are well aware that there have been some recent successful projects at NRH and in the region.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chair. See, one of the concerns I would have is what I call political pushback. You're talking about making sure that the buildings have the right mix and the right locations, but there's communities that want buildings, and I've seen it at the board where there's been councillors on there that have demanded it be built in their community, even though the scoring mechanism was not leading to that building to be built. It was leading for another building to be built. That's when it goes back to my original questions of this group that's controlling it and making the decisions. Will that ultimately, you see council being the deciding makers of where these buildings are going, or do you see, because right now NRH is sort of an independent arm's length organization that are making these decisions strategically to match what's happening at the region here. But if it becomes a regional item, who do you see making those decisions? Do you see the council themselves making the direct, saying, okay, this is where the building's going to go in this community? Because I'll see from past, you'll see votes that occur. So that's not going to really help your housing mix at this point in time. So maybe you could elaborate that. Did you look at any of the political pushbacks when you were developing your report?
I think when it comes to the kind of political element, that's going to obviously play in any sort of a decision. What I would see kind of being undertaken is, if the portfolio planning function and the real estate function is going to be retained within NRH, and the staff there have the time to conduct the proper due diligence to determine what sort of changes might potentially be made within the portfolio and which ones might be redeveloped, intensified, or what have you. That work would be done, and a recommendation could be brought forward to this coalition that I described earlier, and then brought forward to the council. So it would be, I would foresee the council making the ultimate decision, but by well-founded and objective analysis and findings that would have been conducted at the NRH level.
Okay, I'll leave that on that point. Then you mentioned, through Mr. Chair, the other question I had was, you mentioned, I just received a copy of a letter that was addressed to our chair regarding the Minister of Housing, and it highlighted a few items in it. And I just wanted to, I know you mentioned that you read the report. Did the report get incorporated into your recommendations? And was there anything stated in there which the letter states that there's several items, but one of the ones is the ministry will be undertaking an information gathering process to better understand how service managers are administering their wait lists across the province. It goes on to talk about that. How do you see that fitting into what's trying to be accomplished here through the ASD? Should there be a little bit of a hold back on moving forward because the province wants to look at that, and they're looking at a whole pile of stuff, and housing is very legislated. So if they come out with some, like if you move forward with this ASD, move forward with some different the recommendation here, moving forward with the hybrid model, all of a sudden you come out and there's some new legislation. Are we jumping the gun a little too soon and maybe wait, and I'm not saying wait forever, but I said they talk about a 3-month review of maybe putting this on hold in terms of starting to implement some recommendations until we find out more of what the provincial government's going to do. What's your thoughts on that?
Thank you for your question, and through the chair, I think my response to that is, you mentioned there's I think we're referring to the same letter. There's a lot of different comments in there. I'm happy to address any of them, but to more directly address your question, when I think about the 6 areas that we were asked to look at in the report and all the recommendations that have been made, I fully acknowledge none of them are easy. And I think that the 2 biggest ones, if you will, all of them kind of have their place, I think, in the recommendations, but the 2 biggest being the first one, separation of the property management and service manager function, and the second one being consultations with the not-for-profit sector for potentially engaging in community joint ventures to increase housing and supply. If I think of those as the 2 big ones, to me, both of those are very lengthy processes. We already spoke about the consultation that's required with community not-for-profit partners. That could be a year-long consultation if you're going to do it right. In terms of the separation of the property management and the service manager function, I also don't see that as something that is immediate. A lot of time needs to be taken into understanding the roles and responsibilities within NRH as well as within the community services division within the region, which would be most impacted. Doing almost an inventory of skill sets and roles and responsibilities. And then to develop an implementation plan that would allow for that to actually happen. So I see that as, we haven't mapped it out in terms of a timeline, but at the very least a 3 to 6 or more month sort of a process. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and would also allow for the region to potentially course correct if needed, if some legislation was to come out that would be kind of in contradiction, I guess, to some of these initiatives, should the region choose to move forward.
Okay. I have some other questions, but they're more related to the report, so I'll leave them for the report. Thank you for your efforts in bringing this forward. And I know the report's going to speak about a committee of a whole meeting that Councillor Volpatti mentioned. I think it's very critical. Housing is a very complex issue, and if council can give it its full due diligence through a committee of a whole meeting, it makes a lot of sense, and I hope you can attend that. So my question is, if we do have one, are you able to attend as part of that process? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation and the report. A couple of questions for you. The terms of reference, the original terms of reference that you were hired under were developed and proposed by the Alternative Service Delivery Committee. I don't know whether that's, you can answer that, or through you, Mr. Chairman. The original terms of reference were through the Alternative Service Delivery, not the Social Services Committee.
Through the chair, I'm not aware of all of the participants in development of that scope. There was an initial scope that was developed that we did input into as advisors, but at the region, everyone who inputted, I'm not fully aware.
Okay, thank you.
We have an answer, Councillor. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you. Through the chair, the ASD committee itself was struck by council. The scope of the committee and the scope of the assignment was roughed out in that original report. It was broken down to phase 1. We're at phase 2 now, phase 2 and phase 3. The detailed assignment was based upon the original approvals from council, and the assignments and the scope was determined by the ASD task force committee itself. But a lot of the scope determination was actually done by this council through the formation of the committee.
Okay, so thank you. You haven't had a chance to present this to the Social Services Committee, I would assume. Is that fair?
So far, we've presented this to just the task force.
Right. Well, the Social Services Committee is primary responsibility for this housing and always has. So I'm interested to see through you, Mr. Chairman, that this report be presented to that Social Services Committee. And my second question about the terms of reference is, when was you given this assignment, and what was the state of the governance makeup of the board makeup? Is that did you do this based on the previous board makeup or the most recent arrangement where I believe that the board is now the majority of regional councillors, or at least we have 5 or something? So two things. What's the makeup of the board right now, and was that the same makeup that you undertook this program or this study?
Yeah, so through the chair, probably not best placed for me to comment on the exact current configuration, but we started this assignment about a year ago, so that would have been the previous makeup of the board. In the report, we do acknowledge that some changes were being undertaken with respect to the board, and that at the time of the preparation of the report, it was difficult to ascertain whether or not the impact of those changes, and it would take some time to make that determination.
So through you, Mr. Chairman, the assumptions that you would have been operating under would have been the previous board makeup, where
Yes.
council did not have the majority of the seats on the board, and it was a much bigger board.
Yes.
All right. So to me, Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned that this was based on the former governance, and we have changed the governance significantly. And just before I go too far down that road. What is the makeup of the board at the moment?
Yeah, we have just installed the new board members. So that means there's 5 councillors that are sitting on it currently, and there's 3 members at large. And there's an advertised position right now that's open, so if anyone's interested, to put their application in through the clerk's office for a 4th member and a public member at large.
So the current board is based on regional councilors, 5, others 4. Right, so and that was a significant difference that brought, to my mind, the control of this regional housing into the jurisdiction of the, majority of council, instead of, I think we had councilors were a minority on the board under the circumstances that you took this project on. And that's a significant difference. So my second question then is about the extent of public consultation. Because I recall back George Marshall and Mike Collins and myself were involved way back there when the government first started doing this download project. And we had a number of public meetings where there was a significant concern and pushback from the public that they felt regional council was not the place they wanted to see the responsibility rest. They were concerned about the council would only be worried about the cost, and they were worried that council would have other things on their mind than the priority of housing. Yeah. And that's why the structure got set up as it was. And we've significantly changed that. And I think we need to go back to the public and understand where our stakeholders and where the general public sit on this. Because this is this is a very significant change when you add both the board member change, which I supported, but the direction of this, which I'm not enthralled with. I'm not enthusiastic about this separation between, well, how did you say it, property management versus service management. I'm concerned about this, and I would like to see this presented to the corporate service, or to the Social Services Committee as well. I see, Mr. Chairman, in the recommendation that it's going to be committee of the whole, and that we're not really going down any road at this point other than to say we're going to present this to the committee of the whole for further consideration. Is it possible, and through you, Mr. Chairman, to have this presented to Social Services as well? So I know if it goes to regional council, that there's a whole bunch of people on Social Services Committee who will have very little chance to speak to it at council.
I know it's a practice, and that the clerk will probably hit me on the shoulder soon about the same reports going to different committees. So it is quite appropriate that this go from here to committee of the whole rather than here and social services and committee of the whole and council. So if your question is to make sure the appropriate people are around the table, certainly at committee of the whole, everybody is at the table. And so that's the recommendation that's here, and that's, I suspect the clerk would advise, now that it's already at corporate services, shouldn't go to social services as well, but in fact will be at committee of the whole where everybody's at the table.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, can we take it to social services before council takes further steps on this? I understand the practices and what's possible, but thinking, and I understand alternative services is a corporate services kind of mandate, but this is also going to happen with the senior citizens, which is also the senior citizens long-term care homes, which is also Social Services Committee. And I think I want to make this clear at this point that this kind of recommendation should go to the committees that are getting the alternative, that have delivered the alternative service. And I'm happy that it goes to both because it deserves a lot of time and attention. So I'm not sure what the process is, Mr. Chairman, but I would like to see this referred to the Social Services Committee as so that they can bring it to both committees can have their say, and then it comes to committee of the whole.
Councillor Burgess.
Thank you. Through the chair, we did give some thought to it. Because there's more than one motion in this report, and Two of the motions refer to the ability for the Niagara region to enter into joint ventures, and one to use tax increment financing, which is purely within the scope of this committee. We thought it was most appropriate to bring it to corporate services. The committee that is dealing with some of the service level aspects, we're saying all this committee is doing is referring it to a committee of the whole, where the responsibility is. And I just want to also emphasize that the service manager function is a function that is council's responsibility, okay? And therefore, when we're talking about quote unquote governance, I know we're throwing the word governance around a lot in this debate, and we can discuss the governance aspect of it. But what we're really talking about here is the responsibility of who's doing what with regards to the obligations as set out by the province. And therefore, we had, through consultation with both the chair and the co-chair of the Alternative Service Delivery Task Force, that this was the most appropriate and the recommendation going to committee of the whole, because frankly, it is council's full responsibility to that. If this council or this committee wants to change the recommendation to take it to a working committee and then up to council as a whole, they can do that. But I just don't want to lose the fact that there are two very specific corporate service motions on here that are actually actionable after they're passed, that would not be in the domain of the Social Services Committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any concerns about and I appreciate the notion that it goes to committee of the whole. And alternative services delivery is, you're talking about the finances and that aspect. I don't see any problem with the corporate service or the Social Services Committee also having a look at this in the committee setting before it gets to the committee of the whole. And I'm looking for a way that would be permissible, in some way that we can achieve that, and then both committees will have had further examination and look at it before we get to the committee of the whole. So recommendation one is it be referred to a future committee of the whole, which could be somewhere down the road. It can also be referred to the next Social Services Committee without disrupting this committee of the whole timing. And I would offer that amendment then, Mr. Chairman, if...
On a point of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Councillor.
We shouldn't be discussing the report. I left because I have some suggestions too. I left my questions to the presenter at this point in time. So
yeah, that's in order, Councillor. Thanks. And Councillor Timms, I'm not sure. I wouldn't see that as an amendment. I see that more as a referral motion, which I would say is out of order since you've been speaking for about 11 minutes.
Yeah, but recommendation says be referred. But I'll leave it till we get.
I know, but if you want to refer the whole thing to Social Services, so there's a couple more speakers. There's some people that want to speak to the report. We've got some time.
Thank you.
Let's keep circling back. Councillor Quirk.
Thank you, Chair, and I have no further questions to the presenter. I now want to speak to the report. Is that appropriate now? I see no other speakers.
That's completely appropriate, Mr. Ning. Thanks so much.
And I'd like to thank the presenter for the work he does, but don't go too far.
Yeah, don't leave the building. you can have a seat, but if you don't mind sticking around, the event there's additional questions that do arise.
And to that point, Chair, if I could see the recommendations on the screen, I've sent an amendment to number 2 to Anne-Marie to put up there with respect to the timing and the process, and I'd like to talk to that amendment. Specifically, the recommendation number 2 says that the following recommendation, which came from the Alternative Service Delivery Task Force, be referred to the Committee of the Whole. The problem, sorry, we'll get it on there. What I'm asking to be changed is that we approve the recommendation, which is what directs staff to start investigating and have something to present to us at the Committee of the Whole to debate. As it stands right now, this is purely a logistical thing. We would be taking this particular recommendation to Committee of the Whole to direct staff to do an investigation and provide us with information to debate at a future Committee of the Whole, which seems to me one step too many. What I'm asking for is that the wording be that the recommendation be approved, and then the wording within the report saying structure shall be brought back to committee and council should be brought back to Committee of the Whole. So that's my amendment. I believe I have a seconder in Councillor Volpatti, and if anyone has any questions to that, it's purely a logistic thing. Otherwise, we'd actually be taking these recommendations to council on the 22nd. We would then be taking that recommendation to a Committee of the Whole past the 22nd at some point to then debate whether we want this report with this information that the task force has decided it needs to have a fulsome and informed debate, and then come back to a committee of the whole later on. So all I'm saying is let's bypass the step. Let's get the staff working on this investigated proposed hybrid operating structure so we have something to talk about and we know what we're looking at when we come to committee of the whole. Otherwise, committee of the whole is all going to be about whether we receive the E&Y report, which we have, and whether we actually want to see what a hybrid model looks like. Because I can see the debate at committee of the whole being, well, we don't know what the hybrid model looks like. Councillor DeAngelo had all sorts of questions as to what it would look like and whether there would be a further misalignment and where it would go to. We know at the Alternative Service Delivery Task Force that there were lots of questions, some of them in closed session because it involves personnel issues that have to be discussed in a committee of the whole and to see a greater discussion about it. So that's the basis of my amendment. And if that is seconded, I'd ask that we vote on that.
Seconded by Councillor Volpatti, I believe. Okay, thank you. We've got an amendment list. Councillor Maves, do you want to speak to the amendment?
Chair, just really as a point of order, how did we get from questions to the presentation to speaking about the motion? I put my name on following Councillor Quirk to speak to the presenter, and Councillor Quirk
he's still
right
here.
to the.
He can. We're going to speak to the amendment right now. If you don't have any questions on the amendment, we'll go back to the main motion, and Mr. Ning is still here to answer any questions.
Was the amendment on the floor when the speaker was speaking?
No, Councillor Quirk just put it on the floor right now.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor DeAngelo to the amendment.
Yeah, I'm looking. Yeah, I won't be supporting the amendment. The whole process of moving it to a committee of a whole was to have a wholesome discussion on this. It sort of ties into Councillor Timms, who says send it to the Social Services Committee. There's members that aren't here. This is a really huge step in where this council wants to go with this. And is this the decision we want to make? By saying all of a sudden we're going to be moving forward to the hybrid model, we're making that decision. I think you need a wholesome discussion regarding that. And this is only at committee level. And I didn't think it would be appropriate because actually the board suggested and supports going to a committee. The Niagara Regional Housing Board suggested that this go to a committee of a whole structured meeting, because when we deal with council matters, we seem to have sometimes difficulty getting through our agendas. So this needs a evening of its own for some discussion, some input, answering some more questions. So that was the whole context of not making a decision, but referring the whole item. And I'm just speaking to the amendment, but I'll speak to the other 3 and 4 later to address Commissioner Burgess's comments regarding part of this doesn't need to go there, part of it can move forward, but I'll discuss that later because it doesn't deal with the amendment.
Chair, final speaking to the amendment. If anyone else wants to speak to the amendment?
Yep.
Recognize it's the second time, but I guess the point is we are not making a decision on the hybrid model. We're getting the information necessary to make a decision on the hybrid model. That was what the Alternative Service Delivery Task Force asked for. So if we don't have the information, we're going to go to a committee of the whole, and we will be making conversation and discussions without actually knowing what it is we're debating and what the hybrid model looks like. So this isn't directing us to implement the hybrid model. It's asking for the information we need to make an informed decision before we go to committee of the whole. I fully support going to committee of the whole, having a fulsome discussion, a full evening on this, and multiple evenings if necessary, because this is a significant change in how we are talking about delivering the services we need. But at this point, we will go to committee of the whole to decide whether we want to instruct staff to get us the information we need to have at a future committee of the whole. So this is just saying, if we're going to have the committee of the whole, let's have the appropriate information in front of us to make that discussion relevant and not just waste an evening to come here and discuss it.
You okay, Councillor Maves, on the amendment? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So I want to speak to the amendment, but I'm going to ask a question of the presenter while doing that, if that's okay with you, Chair.
If it's tied to the amendment,
it's completely tied.
Okay.
I don't know if he wants to return or.
Sure, Mr. Ning, if you don't mind.
So I just want to, while he's walking up, I want to point out that this is, I believe, the 3rd time we've had this recommendation. We had this in the previous council. We had a study done, and the recommendation came forward at Community Services that the administrative functions be brought in-house. There were synergies and savings to be found with our own communities and social services staff. And we blocked it then. certain councillors blocked it then. And now we've brought an outside independent look at this, and they've come forward with the same recommendation that was received in the past. And we've heard from your presentation that most other municipalities have this model that you're asking us to adopt. I just want to know about your level of discussions and communications with our community services department when you're putting this together.
Through the chair, as part of the task force, we did have consultations and have received input. So it's not been excluded from consideration.
Okay, and did you review those past reports and recommendations from staff that we adopt this?
We were made aware of them, but through the chair, we were made aware of them. But in conducting our study, we really wanted to stay as independent and non-biased as possible. And we really did try to give it a fresh look when considering the different options.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Chair, because this has been here before, because we continually reach the same conclusion by our staff, by outside experts, and I believe that there's some work that's been done by our audit committee staff that comes to the same conclusion that I don't know if we've formally seen yet. I don't know if it's completed yet. So I'm definitely going to support this amendment, and I'm definitely going to support this motion, because we can't keep tap dancing around this. We need to move forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Well stated. Seeing no other speakers, I'll call the question on the motion amendment. Sorry, Councillor Easton, you have something on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to speak to the amendment. Mr. Chairman, I will support the amendment because this motion, as it's constructed, clearly moves council and anyone else who's going to be discussing this matter away from a revisionist view. One of the biggest challenges that we had when the ASD committee began to meet was the fact that we could not get beyond the belief that this was so complex that nobody could figure it out. That the only way to do this was the way it was being done and had been done, that it was the best model ever. And that essentially the EOS was so complex and the risks were so high, and we absolutely had to put the brakes on that. Otherwise, we were going to go nowhere. So, and I have to tell you, I think it's very important for this committee and for all of council to understand that there has been a tension between the committee and the consultant throughout the process. Why? Because the consultant insisted on having this arm's length relationship with the committee, which in fact we understood and agreed that it should happen. He was not coming to consult with us. The consultant was out doing the consultant's work. And we definitely did have community services involved in our meetings, and that is why we understand so well what that operational relationship needs to look like and what it can look like. So I think this is the correct way to do this because it focuses on an outcome that is end user friendly, which is really what we are concerned about. And I think that it will thrust us forward. It's not going to pull us back into the past. And I appreciate Councillor Quirk's amendment. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. I'll call the vote on the amendment. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. Back to the main motion. I believe we still have a speakers list there.
Thank you, Chair. I have nothing further to the main motion.
Okay, thank you. Main motion, Councillor Maves.
I've said what I would like to say to the main motion too, Chair. So thank you.
Okay. Councillor Grenier, as a courtesy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm patient waiting for this. I'm okay with this going to the Committee of the Whole and deal with what you need to do with strategic tools here at Corporate Services and send that off to Council. I came here today to be supportive. I'm glad, thank you, from the committee to move the surplus back to Niagara Regional Housing Corporation. And I'm going to start there. I've always believed, Mr. Chairman, that an independent, flexible, progressive, independent corporation, which was the original vision by those in council, to set that up, to create the delivery mechanism for this important service to the public. Unfortunately, that really never got off the ground. And it's always been that sort of reactive on both sides. And no one's to blame for this. Councillor D'Angelo rightly pointed out the moving targets constantly from provincial legislation and the inherent internal tensions here between departments never really allowed that independent corporation to develop and do its work. It's never really had a clear mandate. But my concern about this motion and where we might end up at a committee of the whole is it's somewhat inverted. Actually, it's totally inverted. Not going to be nice about this anymore. There is no comprehensive housing policy for the regional municipality of Niagara. Zero. We are totally in silos, delivering mandated services from the province. We do it. We're actually not bad at it, but we have almost 5,000 families on the wait list, and we're talking about structures rather than how do we best spend 14% of the levy money on solutions. And we're not talking about that. We've spent an hour and a half talking about who gets to sit on boards and who does what and that. And, again, that's the way that we've always actually dealt with this file. I believe it's time that we actually developed a total overarching housing policy and then slot the work from this committee and the expertise that we have here in the building into the right places to deliver to our people. And, and the right direction from the board at housing when we first saw this, and Mr. Burgess made it, was to make sure that council understood the gravity of the decision, was to come here and have the committee of the whole with the appropriate time for council to have the right kind of fulsome debate about this issue and actually develop the appropriate solution moving forward. And again, rightly so, the uncertainty was pointed out that we have a provincial election that may change everything coming up, plus our own election, which may change some of the dynamic moving forward. And to take the appropriate amount of time to actually address this issue properly. And the committee of the whole is a great first step. And if anybody is kidding themselves here that we're going to get a decision after a 2.5-hour conversation, I hope we disabuse ourselves of that notion that it is the beginning. And that we need to understand that spending, between fees, grants, and levy, we spend $65 million on housing. And to make sure that we get it right. And, the other part that we need to understand is that only 30% of the residents in our buildings are on OW or OSDP. 70% of our people have some kind of income. We maintain social order. It's called affordable housing for a reason, and we need to get it right. And I've spoken a few times about owning the policy. And that's what we need to do. We need to own ourselves as legislators, own the policy, and then talk about the solutions and how to get it done. And I hope that this committee of the whole meeting, when it's scheduled, I don't care where it goes first, I just want the appropriate amount of time, that everyone is appropriately backgrounded, the material is there, and we can have a meaningful conversation about believing in what we do and actually assign the appropriate policy direction to our staff, who are actually very good at what they do on both sides. Through the property management, the progress we've made in the past few years on that, the brave people at the front line that slot people into provincial degrees of homelessness and housing without going crazy. I have all the time in the world for these people and the work that they do on a daily basis, but they deserve better from us. We need to have a direction. I've said this also a few times that maybe we could start with housing. This isn't necessarily the real challenge. Housing is a solution to our social and income inequality problems. Embrace that kind of decorative statement that everyone's entitled to a home, that housing is a solution. And then let's move from that kind of to a policy where we can actually start assigning the amount of money that we do, the wonderful work that our staff resources, and then the report that we have in front of us, and then we can move on. But I think if we just talk about the structures and who does what, and if for 2 hours, I think we're spinning our wheels. Councillor Maines is correct. But to talk about solutions before we actually identify the known the problem and then talk about a policy moving forward, I think that's what we need to be. So I think everything else is really noise right here. Let's approve moving this on. Give the staff the tools from the finance that they need, and let's talk about this properly and take whatever time necessary to get it right. And sorry, Mr. Chair, thank you for the courtesy. Sorry I went about 2 minutes longer than I expected, but thank you for the time to come and say my piece.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor D'Angelo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of comments I want to address with the motion here. Items 3 and 4 are not specifically related to the ASD. That's stuff that's happening right now. And when we talk about entering into negotiation with the private sector and community partners for the purpose of developing new affordable housing supply under joint partnership agreements. So if we're going to defer this to a committee of a whole, and then I think 3 and 4 should be moved on quickly. I think I'd like to see them separated so that they're taken care of. Then also the use of incremental tax financing. That's what the acting commissioner was talking about. Now that we're approving this and sending it to a committee of a whole, it's a little different. But I think 3 and 4 need to be acted upon right now so we can move forward, because that's what's happening right now. I don't want to leave the impression that Niagara Regional Housing isn't doing anything to increase supply. They're actively working as best they can through the legislation and through the funds that are available. And we saw that earlier the region's committed to that by allocating some additional funds. So those two I'd like to see move forward. The reason I was leaning towards having a committee of a whole meeting regarding the recommendation to move to a hybrid model, I wanted to take that opportunity, and I still will invite Dan Troke to come back and speak on that. He gave me some notes regarding the Ernst & Young report. Some of them were critical, some of them were good. I don't know if I can release that to council. I'm going to get his okay to do that, and if so, I'll release it to all the council members. But I think he would be a good person to come back once we establish this committee of a whole meeting, because he's not an employee of the region. He actually worked there for at least a year, and in terms of working with NRH, knowing probably what some of the problems are, what some of the solutions could be, and some of the positive aspects. This is going to take a wholesome discussion to come to the results of a better system, and we don't know what that better system is. As the consultant said, each of the models has a problem with it. It's just depending on which problems you want to deal with. So moving to a new one right away may not be the correct answer, and especially if we haven't really consulted with the providers. If it's limited consultation, that's not going to be very helpful. You need the more larger consultation with the providers. So my question, I guess, to you, Mr. Chair, because it's being referred to a committee of a whole meeting, when do we see that meeting taking place now that we're approving staff investigating the proposed hybrid operating structure? How much information do they need to come back before we have a meeting? That's my question through you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll take a crack at the concern about what pieces are moving forward and what pieces are being referred. So as it is in front of us now, one is being referred to a future committee of the whole, but to your point, 3 and 4, if committee authorizes and approves today, that will go to council for approval, and that will still proceed. That aspect will not be referred to future committee of the whole, only the items identified. I don't know if that helps.
Okay. No, that helps.
Okay.
But I'm still, my question is though to staff is, how much information is going to be gathered prior to coming to a future committee of a whole meeting in terms of the investigation of the hybrid operating structure? Like, are we going to wait till it's 100% completed, or are we going to come with stages? Like, I need a bit of certainty on what's happening there so I can support the overall motion here. I don't have confidence in the motion right now when it says refer to a committee of whole meeting, but I'm not sure when that's coming back.
Thank you, through the chair. I believe staff can arrange, and obviously I don't have much status in that, so I can set timelines since I won't be responsible for them. But I believe what would be reasonable is 90 days for staff to provide what I would consider a high-level structure back to a committee. And then in that high-level structure, there would be a roadmap that would be included for things that would need to be further investigated or any risks associated with it, so that you could get that kind of a very quick glimpse into what that would look like, what are some of the issues. If council wanted to course direct at that point in time, then you can course direct and then create, more of a final solution. And, in my view, to get to a final solution state, you're probably looking at 6 to 8 months before a final report. But I think you can develop the project so that within 3 months or 90 days, you'd get really clear direction with the key high-level risks and issues associated with a move of this nature.
Okay, so then can we put that into the motion then? I'd like to amend that so that we have a specific date. If you're saying 3 months, add 3 months from today and throw that in there. So we're looking April, May, so June.
So, Councillor, the committee of the whole meetings are at the call of the chair, and I'm just hearing from staff, they, rather than saying in 3 months, within 3 months, and if it's before that, that's great, but just in terms of allowing the clerks appropriate dates and things like that.
I have no issue with that, but just so that the time frame is in there, so that we know when it's going to be coming forward. So by the end of June, we're looking at some sort of meeting discussing of the high-level components of what's going forward here. Am I hearing that correctly?
So,
okay, so the commissioner sounds like he's agreeable to that.
Correct.
And then, and it sounded like the commissioner also gave an option there of course correcting. So if there's need any course corrections at that time, there's an opportunity from council to look at it at that point in time.
I'm going to say yes, Councillor. So, okay, I'm going to refocus for a second. Within 3 months, I don't think that needs a formal amendment. It's fine with the mover and seconder. Who's the mover and seconder originally? Councillor Volpatti, Councillor Easton, you're okay with the addition of a committee of the whole meeting held within 3 months?
Should it not be added to items 1 and 2?
Added to items 1 and 2?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Councillor D'Angelo?
Okay, just, what was that? Okay, items 1 and 2, okay. I'm okay with that. That gives me a bit more confidence that we can have a bit of a discussion of coming forward with some of the items that have been identified by some of the councillors. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask that the motion be split so we can vote on them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My concern and my interest is that number 1 be split. And the conversation we just had told us about how this would come back in 3 months, that item 1 is about receiving the Ernst & Young report for information, and that report be referred to the committee of the whole to be held within 3 months. So what I would like to see, and I'll try it again with an amendment, that the Ernst & Young report be received and for information and be referred to committee of the whole with 3 months, and the Social Services Committee next meeting of Social Services Committee for comment and opinion from that committee. So that doesn't affect 3, 4, 5. It just says that the Corporate Services Committee will have a chance to look at the Ernst & Young report, its recommendations, and make comment. And I think that I've heard the frustration of the Alternative Services Delivery Committee that this is not getting universal or immediate acceptance from myself, for example. But I can imagine the frustration of the Social Services Committee, whose prime job every month is regional housing, not having the chance to offer comment and opinion on this Ernst & Young report. So I think from the purposes of advancing the issue, I think it does no harm. It will simply add an opportunity for those that have been on that committee
to have comment on the Ernst & Young report, since we're not saying that we're receiving or accepting the recommendations of the report, we're simply receiving it. So my suggestion, my request is that we add that it be on the agenda for comment at the next Social Services Committee. And that would be an amendment to item 1 that adds referral to the Social Services Committee.
Point of order, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Quirk, go ahead.
I don't see how we can refer something to 2 separate places. It either has to go to a committee. You can't refer something to 2 separate committees in the same motion and direction. That's just contrary to our procedural bylaw. So it either has to go to committee of the whole or to corporate services, not both. So I understand what Councillor Timms is trying to say. I think the appropriate solution for him is to ask one of the chairs of that committee, one of the co-chairs, to add it as an information item on their own, through their own agenda management process, as opposed to us directing and referring something to 2 separate locations.
Mr. Chairman?
Sorry, Councillor Tim. Councillor Easton, do you have a point of order? Okay. Okay, so 1 second. I'm going to rule on the point of order raised by Councillor Quirk. I agree with what Councillor Quirk is saying. I don't find the amendment to be in order, Councillor Timms, because there is a risk of 2 sets of recommendations coming from this committee and Social Services Committee to Committee of the Whole. So I'm going to, with the current resolution that's in front of us, recommendation in front of us saying going to Committee of the Whole, I'm going to rule your amendment out of order, trying to send it somewhere else.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't agree with your ruling. I don't see anything in the bylaws that say that committee cannot refer an item to 2 separate bodies, committees, whatever Councillor Quirk was trying to suggest. I don't think there's anything in the bylaw that excludes us from doing that, and I would ask that you find the bylaw that Mr. Quirk is referring to. I don't think, simply, it's a simple request. I don't understand the need to deny that committee the right to discuss this item. So you are attempting to rule my amendment out of order. Is that what you're saying?
Just 1 moment. I'll ask the clerk to reference the particular bylaw section you were asking for.
Through you, Chair. Section 22.22 of our procedural bylaw states that reports may only be submitted to 1 standing committee for consideration.
So the referral question is not answered by that bylaw. It does not exclude referral.
Councillor, it's already at this committee. So look, my ruling is that you have the opportunity to challenge the ruling if you want, trying to move this forward and expedite it. Councillor Quirk did give you a pathway in terms of speaking with co-chair of the committee to add it as an information item, but certainly keeping in line with the procedural bylaw and my ruling, that's how I'm going to proceed. If you want to challenge the chair, you can do that.
Mr. Chairman, I would rather have it added to the agenda if it's not going to be ruled out of order at that point. I'm not sure what the difference is, and I don't see that the bylaw excludes referring to. It says cannot be reported to, but it does not rule us out of referring. So I don't want to challenge the chair. I want to see this discussed at corporate services. So, or not corporate services, at social services. So I will do my best to get it on the social services agenda, Mr. Chairman. I think you understand my point. And it's frustrating that this, a alternative service delivery committee reports to corporate services no matter what service they're talking about. And this process seems to exclude the committee on the subject matter from the process of a alternative service delivery. That I find frustrating, and as you might tell from my suggested agenda changes here. So I'll do my best to get it on the Social Services Committee for next cycle. What if we pass, my concern is that whatever is passed at Council on Thursday night will preclude by some point of order from adding it on to the agenda of the social services. Because someone will stand up and say, well, you can't add it to the agenda because council's already received and considered. And I don't want to see that happen. So does staff have any advice on how I can avoid that kind of approach that would keep this off of the social services agenda?
Thank you. Through the chair, I believe, just to restate your question, Councillor Timms, is you're asking that once this gets approved by council, that is there any mechanisms that would block the report, the ENY report, from being added for information purposes to an agenda item of social services? I don't believe there is, but I believe anyone can add anything to the agenda through the appropriate mechanisms of that committee to receive that report and to review that report.
Well, I'll take your word on that, and I'll trust I'll have support of members that it will be added and discussed at that committee. So I will accept your word on that, and we'll see what happens next cycle. So I'll speak to the chair of those committees and see if we can get that happened, and I'll have their answer before Thursday night. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Timms. Councillor Rigby, I'm going to go to Councillor Diodati first as a member of the committee, and then I'll come back to you. Councillor Diodati?
Chair, I just want to call the vote. I think we've dealt with this far too long. Let's call the vote and let's get on with the order of council here.
Thank you, Councillor. So, Councillor Rigby, I apologize. The vote has been called, and you're not a member of the committee. So, yeah, I will take the split.
I just have a request of staff.
Vote has been called.
To make sure that this committee of the whole is on a proper night and not jammed in front of a council meeting. And on the cycle of meetings, we've been screwing up
Councillor Tim,
all the
Councillor
time.
Rigby,
So,
I hear
Mr.
you.
Chair, I
It's
just
at the
bring
call
that.
of the chair. It's not up to staff. So with that, there was been a request to split. Councillor Timms, you wanted to split one from the rest, or you want to split every item?
One, I think Councillor D'Angelo wanted some others split, so I would like, my request is for one.
Okay, so for now, we're just going to split out number one. Councillor D'Angelo, did you want to split any others?
Yeah, I would like to split two.
Okay, 1 and 2, and then 3, 4, and 5 together. I'll look to the clerk to open the vote when ready. Thank you. So we're just going to split one from the rest. On number one only? On one only? How do you vote, Councillor Maves? Yes, okay. Thank you, Councillor Easton. Yes, okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yes, the clerk has requested for clarity to do it one more time. Okay, thank you. And the balance? That's carried, by the way, number one.
The vote is open.
Okay, that's carried as well. Thank you. We do have another report, CSCC 10, 2018. Recommendations for consideration from the Procurement Advisory Committee meeting held February 23rd. Is there a mover or seconder for that? Councillor Edgar, do you want to move those? Okay, thank you. Councillor Diodati, seconded. Thank you. Questions or comments to this report or recommendations? Thank you. Councillor Maves, go ahead.
So I'm reading this that we're developing our own e-bidding solution. unique to the region. And if that's the case, how are we, the big problem I have with the current system, which is more universally known by suppliers and contractors, still lots of contractors and suppliers miss when we put bid things up on these systems. How do we guarantee, like, the problem is I want more and more contractors and suppliers to see our bids. So how are we going to ensure that a substantive number of contractors and suppliers are on this system?
Thank you. Through the chair, we're not developing our own. We actually piggybacked on the procurement that the city of Hamilton and a number of their neighboring jurisdictions did. So the recommendation is to move to e-procurement. What we do have to do internally, though, is develop the procedures and the policies to deal with electronic bidding. So that's what we'll be developing internally. But to your second question, it's a good question, because when I came here as director in procurement, one of the KPIs that we wanted to develop was how many bids are we receiving per public offering, and I think it's a critical KPI for us to move forward. By moving to, one of the benefits by moving to the e-solutions is that the bidder, once they're part of the e-solutions framework, they get to see everything that e-solutions is bidding on. So that'll be City of St. Catharines, Pelham, Niagara Falls, because they're all moving towards this system. So there's more bidders attracted to that system because there's more municipalities on that system. And then I think procurement staff needs to do even further on that, where we also post on our own website to, in case someone's not part of that system, they can still see any bids. And we're looking at using our regional Twitter account to announce when bids and proposals are going out, and other things to to try to create attention to that. So one of the reasons for that movement, Councillor Maves, is to go to a platform where there are more bidders and more eyeballs on the bids, and that's why one of the reasons why we chose e-solutions.
I'm not going to move a motion or amendment or anything like that, but I just want to say to yourself and the CAO that I think it's important to do active outreach in addition to that. If you have to advertise that that we're moving to this, and if you have to call vendors of record and say we're moving to this, like, I think you should kind of leave no stone unturned at the beginning of the process to make sure everyone's aware of it, and we don't do a tender down the road for something and we get two bids where we should have 12. So I just want to make that point. I think it's absolutely critical when we're moving to a new system.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Quirk.
Just very briefly, Chair, because the Commissioner mentioned the Twitter account, I think it would be appropriate, because of the targeted audience for something like this, that the region communications team determine the need for a dedicated Niagara Region Twitter account, because if you have contractors following our regular Twitter account where we have the job postings and we have the conversations about quitting smoking, I think they probably prefer to have just a dedicated Twitter account that they can follow when bids are opening and closing, and linking to the website appropriately. That's my only comment on that.
Seeing no other speakers, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Thank you. We do have 3 consent items for information. I'll take a mover in block. Councillor Quirk, seconded by Councillor Volpatti. Thank you. Questions or comments to any of these items to receive? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Any other business? Councillor Timms.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask that a couple of items be added to the next agenda for corporate services. One is a memo from Jody Middleton, Manager of Organizational Leadership Development. It's a memo that deals with employee diversity practices, and I think it's a memo that's worthy of council to receive because of a meeting of the Niagara Anti-Racism Coalition that I attended a few months ago, where there was a concern expressed that our staff were not dealing with diversity issues appropriately, and I was confident that we do make an effort to make sure that there's no racism involved in any of our services, and the memo was created to show how that is addressed within the corporation. So I wanted to have that on our agenda It may simply be received for information at that point. The second item is the 2018 or most recent recommendations from the Emergency Services Committee that deals with the Bill 175 and the latest recommendations on arbitration. That'll affect our police budget, affects our EMS most directly. It's the Emergency Services Steering Committee, the latest recommendation to the minister regarding 175. So we can just have that on the agenda. And the third one is the human report on the current AMO and ESSC position on marijuana in the workplace. I've heard that as yeah, some are all for it, some are against it. The concern has been raised up about, and we should want to hear from Human Resources how we plan to deal with that when it comes to our equipment drivers, our operators, and emergency services of any sort. So if those items could be on the report, the next meeting for information, then be up to committee as to what kind of questions they want to pose to them. So if staff have those notes, Mr. Chairman, I'd appreciate it.
They have been captured and will be considered as part of the agenda management process.
Which means doesn't say yes yet. Is that what you're saying?
We'll see what the full agenda looks like and we'll consider the timing at that time.
Thank you.
There is no closed session. Our next meeting is April 4th. Councillor Easton, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry that I had to leave the room. However, I want to advise that I will be bringing a notice of motion to the next council meeting regarding the bylaw of the Chief Administrative Officer, in which I will be recommending that we change it so that council receives discussion with the CAO for the hiring of positions above the director. And the reason that I'm suggesting this is because I think that over the period of time that Mr. Jangelo has been the CAO, that we've had very few opportunities to fully understand and have conversations with him on the direction he's moving in. Mr. Chairman, are you having a problem with?
Oh, go ahead. So I'm checking with the clerk in terms of validity of raising a notice of motion at committee versus raising it at council. So I appreciate that you're bringing it here, but I think it's more warranted at council.
I wasn't aware that there was a procedure that prohibited me.
Well, I want to be sure so everyone knows that you're following it. So you don't raise it here and then it's at council and someone says what happened, right?
Thank you.
So Councillor Easton, given your oral or verbal notice of motion here, you'll still have to send something in writing to the clerks in advance of the full council meeting.
In advance. Thank you very much for your advice, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor D'Angelo, other business?
Yeah, just if I could refer it to staff, the parking lot was an issue today. I don't know if our snow removal is the same person as normal, but they put a lot of snow in parking spots. And I drove around for 5 minutes. I know Councillor Hodgson drove around for 10 minutes looking for a parking spot. And I was all over the parking lot and there was none available. So I ended up parking in front of a snow bank. I don't know if that's something they could just look at their, the contractor, just work with them so that it gets pushed. Because some of it got pushed on parking spots when they could have just pushed it right into the grass in the field out in the back. And that took about 4 or 5 spots. It's just a concern because there's certain days where it's really busy here and there's a lot of people. And what's happening is when you take those spots up, you're forcing people to park across the street and they're taking a shortcut across the street. So if I just leave that with staff to look into if they can address that.
Yeah, I think they have acknowledged they are working with the contractor.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other business, I'll call the meeting adjourned. Thank you.